Someone pointed out that I hadn't published the Webster 3 reading exam yet. So I published that, and I think you've got till Wednesday to check that off. I've actually gone ahead, finished off, and published the rest of the Webster readings, as well as the facts and fallacies. So you can actually work ahead as fast as you want on the readings. Still haven't looked at your deliverables or your status reports. So if you have stuff you want to clean up or finish, do that. I'll get to those this week and let the project managers know if I have any issues or concerns. Other than that, anything? Any questions or anything? No. Okay. Okay, let's talk about PEPLeware Part 2. This isn't from the book. This is just something I found some time ago. How many of you have had this experience where there's been a section of code that if someone takes it out or changes it, everything stops working, but you can't figure out why? This gets back to what Brooks said about the inherent complexity, and no simple bullet. The inherent complexity of software, that you can literally have astronomical state spaces, and sometimes they pass through certain space regions, and if you mess with anything there, things stop working, and you don't necessarily know why. Usually the only way to get rid of a section like that is literally just rewrite the program and hope that you can get it to work correctly with your rewrite, which you may or may not be able to do. Furniture police. How many of you have worked in situations where you've had your own office? I have. How many of you worked in situations where it's kind of like this? Large open spaces. What are the things that you're usually told about the benefits and the so on of having these large open spaces where you plop down with your laptop and you code with everyone else around you? Have you been given any excuses for that? Yes.
Well,
pull your mask so we can all hear you.
when I worked as an intern, I thought it was funny looking back. Just they plopped me in with like the back end people, and I was like doing character support, and like we're gonna put you next to the back end guys so you can like get help from them with any questions. But I realized now I was just like interrupting them a lot whenever I didn't know anything.
Oh yeah, yeah. Who else? Anyone else have stories about being plopped in? That first item is the important one. Those who usually decide this don't live with it. Some do. SpaceX, Elon Musk doesn't have an office. He sits in a cubicle like everyone else. Who I suspect he spends as little time there as possible. But this gets back to the idea. First, the justification is, oh, people will collaborate, or you'll be able to communicate better, or whatever. Okay. How well do you develop when you have people asking you questions every 10 minutes? What's that experience like? Anyone? Yeah.
No, you don't get any developing done at all.
Yeah. Basically, you spend all this time building the mental construct in your head, and then someone comes back and talks to you. I'm pretty sure I haven't told this story here yet. So, first time story. Oasis Systems FTL Games. I'm deep into coding Sundog. I'm doing this on an Apple II. I literally have the whole memory map, 64K in my head. And I'm doing some very serious coding with the graphics system. And I'm trying to remember what's where in memory and what I have to do and so on. And Wayne, I had this little office in one part of our complex. And Wayne Holder, the president, high school friend guy hired me, walks in and starts asking me a question. And I turn and look at him, and I don't say anything. I just sit there with my mouth. And he sort of looks at me, and he asks me the question again, and I just shake my head no, which isn't a response to his question. It's just like, go away. And he sort of like looks mildly offended and walks off. And I finished my work. I was able to preserve everything I had sitting in my head. And a couple hours later, I sought him out and said, Wayne, you have to understand, this is what, I was deep into this, and he instantly understood, because Wayne is actually one of the best programmers I've ever known. He's like, oh yeah, he said, I probably shouldn't have come in and bothered you without, some sort of heads up. But that flow is important, and when you've got noise, it distracts you. My daughter Crystal, the software engineer, talks about dealing with this at the place where she's been working, except she just changed jobs. Good for her. And she says they give us cubicles, and of course they've all been working at home really since COVID hit, and they're doing hoteling at their offices and so on and so forth now. But she talks about being in cubicles. She says, yeah, I have, noise canceling headphones and everyone else, but that doesn't stop from people walking up to me. It doesn't stop them from, bothering me. And he said, frankly, it doesn't stop some of them from talking loud enough for me to hear over my noise canceling headphones. At Pages Software, we were a startup, so we were in an initial set of offices, and we were all crammed in there. And when we closed on venture funding, we leased an entire building for ourselves. And one of the things I insisted on got was every single engineer had her or his own office with a door. And I think that tremendously added to our productivity. Each of the doors, each of the offices had side windows alongside the door, so you could look in and see if someone was there before you knocked or not. And you could see what they were doing before you knocked or not. Even with that, my most productive time, as I think I said a week or two ago, was still in the evening. Because there were still interruptions, there were still meetings, there were still questions that had to be answered, especially, I was chief software architect and CTO, so there was stuff I had to do besides coding. But this move towards open space, it doesn't work. There have been study after study that show people are less productive. That noise, that interruption, that stuff like that makes you less productive. And you'll come up with all these justifications. Spontaneous collaboration. No, if I'm coding, the last thing I want to do is talk to them. If I want to talk to someone, I'll have lunch with them. Or I'll go to the kitchen and get a snack and wait till they show up. Or I'll send them an email and say, can I talk to you after work? This whole idea of the spontaneous collaboration just really, yes, it can happen in that setting, and the loss of productivity, and frankly, the loss of job satisfaction isn't worth it. Any observations, questions, things that you've seen, experienced? Yes?
All I know is the worst was when the sales team was in the same open space as
Oh,
the
God.
developers.
Oh, man.
Oh.
Yeah, that would be really bad. I visited my son, system administrator for a company, very successful company that sells, what do they do exactly? Basically sells telecommunication access or something like that. And I went on a tour of his company, and I was really impressed because I was seeing all these individual offices. And then we got back to where the handful of developers and system administrators were, and it was this big open room with everyone crammed in. I thought, you've given exactly the wrong people the offices. Anyway, same thing, which I've talked about. One of the things, if you read Tempest, you know there are differences in individual performance in development. One of the things that Mark and Lister found is that there's also differences in development teams. There's some that are highly productive and those that are not. And what they found through their surveys is that top performing individuals and teams have quieter space, more private space, they are better protected from interruption, they have more actual physical space to work in. Yes?
I'm guessing I'm guessing the comment on space improving performance is considering skill level to be equal across two example people. Like,
Yes, if you have people with similar backgrounds, first you have to understand studies of individual developer performance. There's been quite a few done over the past 40 or 50 years. And they control for years of experience, education, everything else. And there have been citations anywhere from 2 to 1 to 26 to 1. Differences in individual developer performance in terms of their ability to produce, working code. So yes, the difference is that those who perform better individually and in teams aren't necessarily more talented. They've been given better space. Now, how much the space, quiet, privacy affects versus talent, education, experience, skills, professionalism, and so on, I'm not sure how many studies have been done along those lines. But the simple truth is, if you want your team to be productive, give them a quiet workspace. Protect them from interruption. Keep people away from them. Other questions, observations, experiences? Yes?
The protection from interruption, I'm guessing that's primarily because our line of work is essentially a research space and it requires a lot of complex thought. Because I'm imagining other lines of work where interruption isn't that big a deal.
Well, no, this is very, very much geared towards software engineering,
Okay.
software development. Because, I suspect all of you know what it's like to get in the flow. You're working, you've built up this mental model, and you look up and 4 hours have passed, and you think it's been 30 minutes. And it's why even at Pages, even with their separate offices, even with everything else, my most productive time was after 6 p.m. And really after 7 p.m. So about 2 or 3 a.m. when I'd start to fall asleep and make mistakes, which is when I'd usually quit coding. But the problem is that there's this inherent mindset, and we've already mentioned this and we'll continue to mention it. Management likes predictability. They want to see software development like manufacturing. If we put 5 people on it for 3 months, we will get this done. And that ignores armor, basically. It ignores the fact that you're going to hit dead ends, that if you're doing something new, you've got the research approach, that breakthroughs can happen almost instantaneously, and by the same token, you can beat your head against the wall for weeks or months on a particularly hard problem. Which is why, once again, and you'll probably hear me say this each and every class, the only way to manage schedules is to drop features. You drop the hardest features. You drop the one you're stuck on. Say we're going to live without that, or we're going to dumb it down to the point where we actually know how to fix it. And if along the way we figure out how to do what we originally wanted to do, we can decide whether or not to try to put it in. But without that, we are going to drop it for now. Saving money on space, again, this is what tends to motivate the open things. Oh, we'll have these tables and people bring their laptops, they'll sit there, and that way, we can stagger shifts and have these spaces filled all the time and so on. Once again, the people who do that usually don't limit space for themselves. They usually have the nice corner offices with the windows, so on and so forth. It's again interesting that DeMarco and Lister, again, most of what they report, they did actual studies, mostly in corporate IT settings, so isn't necessarily the startup environment, isn't some of the environments you might find otherwise, but the noise level appeared to have an actual impact on the defects in the code. That the workers who had the fewest defects in their working tended to be very happy with the noise level. And those who had more defects said, over 90% of them said, no, this is not acceptable noise level. It's really annoying. And again, when you have open space, when you have greater workplace density and so on, you have more noise. Now, again, companies say, oh, we give everyone noise reducing headphones. As I said, yeah, that doesn't always work. How many of you have had to program in a noisy environment? If you've already. Anyone want to tell some stories? Come on, I need some stories. Yeah.
Well, I used to work at BYU IT, and we were in the 3rd floor with like the support people, like right next to them. But at least my experience, it didn't hinder me. I kind of like people working.
Became
movement.
white noise.
Yeah, it was nothing. But for my coworker, he hated it because
Yeah.
people would talk like about Disney movies and stuff like that. And it's like, you cannot do anything. For me, it was fine, but it affects them.
That actually, remind me, we'll come back to that. Other stories, yes.
Yeah, so my office is a big open floor. Well, just for like, just for the coders, right? Other people have cubicles and offices. But there's like a team that was working in the corner on like a drone, and part of their programming involved it beeping in different like tones, and it would beep literally from when you get in 30 minutes when you start your shift for the entire day. It's just beeping, and it just drove us absolutely insane.
Calm me down. Yes.
When
Mass?
at my internship, at my internship over the summer, I only got to go in like twice because of COVID. The rest it was just remote. But the couple times I did go in, the office was like a whole open floor, the open floor plan, and it wasn't too noisy from the people, but the air conditioning was so loud,
Oh,
it just
no,
drove
yeah.
me crazy the
Yep.
whole day.
Now, I want to come back to what you're reminded of. How many of you like to listen to music while you program? How many of you can't stand to listen to music while you program? There's a real divide there. No, I always assumed of this, and when I started teaching, I found there are those who really like music. And how many of you have specific playlists that you use when you're coding? Yeah. I have playlists, and also as a writer, I use the same playlist, but I have a set of playlists that are for me sort of musical white noise. I start them, for example, I have in chronological order all the songs by the Moody Blues. Moody Blues, I first heard them when I was 50 years ago, when I was a freshman. No, 54 years ago, my gosh. I was a freshman in high school. So they were one of my favorite bands back then. I have all their stuff. I've been listening to them for over half a century. I can put that in, and it's a nice, pleasing noise, and it never distracts me. Other music I try to listen to, and suddenly I'm like, yeah, that's an interesting song. I didn't notice that lyric before. I have 2 song playlists and some albums that I'll put on repeat. Song playlists are Moody Blues and Elton John. I have most of Elton John's early stuff. And then I have a playlist that's the entire Lord of the Rings soundtrack in order. And I have a playlist that's the entire Star Wars soundtrack from the prequels and the original trilogy in order. And I have, believe it or not, I have the Peer Gynt suite. Actually, Peer Gynt as an operetta with the actual singing in Norse. I became fascinated with Peer Gynt suite music when I was a kid because it was used, Peer Gynt suite was used in a movie I really liked called Pied Piper of Hamelin with Van Johnson. It came out in like '56. And these are things I can put onto the list, and they become white noise, and they stimulate a part of my brain without ever distracting me. And there's other stuff I could, if I tried to listen to, say, all the Beatles songs, I'd be sitting here singing along with all of them. I just wouldn't get much work done. So that's something that fascinates me, that there are developers who, really want or need to have music going, and there are others who say, no, it's too distracting. So, not terribly relevant, but something interesting I've discovered teaching it. And basically they say most firms aren't willing to actually say what will make our developers more productive. This is a lesson I learned Pages. It's why I insisted every engineer have an office. It's why I insisted on free treats. And it wasn't, this wasn't your typical Silicon Valley extravagance. It was soda and like M&Ms and goldfish crackers. But they're all there and they're free. And also we had a policy that if 3 or more developers stayed late to work, we had a drawer with a set of menus from places that would deliver dinner. They could order food and the company would pay for it. And since we were a startup and hadn't shipped yet, and we're just burning money without bringing money in, there are a couple times when John Curry, our CFO, great guy, learned a tremendous amount from him, but he's always looking for places to cut back. It's kind of like, we should really drop this free stuff in the kitchen. I said, John. He said, we have 10 developers. We're probably spending $1 million a year in salary on these 10 developers. I said, if one of them leaves, we will delay shipping for months. I said, you can't spend enough on soda and M&Ms to make up for what we will lose in income if we are even a month later than we would be otherwise shipping. But that's a mindset that a lot of companies don't have. Flow time. We've already been talking about flow time. We talked about this. What are some of your personal experiences with getting lost in coding and then suddenly looking up and realizing how much time you spent? Anyone have some stories I want to tell you?
I was working on a project for work, and I was like really deep in code, and I forgot that I had a meeting with my manager, and I was like 5, 6, 7 minutes late to it. And I got like, I'm sorry, I was really deep in some code, and he's like, that's fine, that's probably better than talking to me. So I was really happy that he had that view of it, and then I've been reading the books for this class, I thought back to that experience.
And that's why meetings through the day are so destructive, because you have to stop. It's why, it's real, you have development companies that say, we have a Discord channel or a Slack channel, and you have to be there and you have to respond. It's like, are you nuts? This is antithetical to flow. If I'm having to sit there and constantly respond to comments or even just pay attention to comments being made. Fortunately, last time I did any serious coding was Pages. We had email, but none of us developers really sent around email after 6 p.m. unless it really was something critical. And you could just avoid looking at your email. It's kind of like, it's been 3 hours. I'll look, oh, hey, that's interesting. Anyone else have stories about flow experiences? Yes?
It's really more of an observation, but I remember that there were some days when I was working that just dragged on forever. And then there are other days I was like, oh, it's 5 p.m. already? And I think most of it comes down to whether or not the problem was interesting enough for me to be able to enter that flow state.
That's actually a very important point, because it's not something you can necessarily turn on, and sometimes you just keep running into walls, keep hitting dead ends, kind of like, oh, this is tedious, it's a pain, I'm not making progress, and then other days, like you said, you sort of find yourself immersed in it, and the hours flow by. I'll also know the same thing happens to me playing games, but that's a whole other topic. There have been too many times I've looked at the clock and said, 10 o'clock, okay, I'll play for another hour, and then I look at the clock and it's 3 a.m. It's like, oh crap. Telephone, touch dated, but this is the same thing. Be willing to shut or schedule your interruptions from social media, be those professional or personal, in order to maintain your phone. Doors. This is an interesting thing, this mindset in the first one. If everyone can't have a window, then nobody can. If everyone can't have a door, then nobody can. Now, in the case of Pages, everyone had a door not everyone had windows because we had about 6 offices that were along an L-shaped wall looking outside. And then we had, I think, another 4 offices that were inside. And like I said, every office had a window right by the door, a sort of door-length window to look in and look out. I don't know if the people in the inner offices felt slighted thereby, but I do know they were all grateful to have an office with a door. Because it made such a difference, particularly from where we've been. Piping music into an open workplace, oh my gosh, that's the worst thing. That's sort of, you're at the mercy of someone else's taste, and it's going to distract you because it's not what you're. For those of you who don't like music, it's awful. For those of you who do like music, you have your own preferences as to what you want to listen to. Last thing you want to listen to is someone else's music. Now, it's good to have places you can gather. We had the kitchen. We had developers. There's 4 of our developers used to go out for lunch and usually go out for about 2 hours. And John Curry, our CFO, actually came to me one day and said, you know, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so are gone to lunch about 2 hours every day. Said, you know, we're concerned about it. And I looked at him and said, are you kidding me? I said, these guys work 10 to 12 hours a day, and I can guarantee you half of what they talk about at lunch is work. I said, I could care less how long they go to lunch. And I could care less. We had no impositions as to when you had to come in, when you had to leave. We just didn't care because we were all working long hours anyway. It didn't matter. And it's really, I saw, this was a conversation, and I don't think either of the 2 people I was talking with on Twitter, people I know and follow on Twitter, are developers, but one said, my management has a meeting every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. And I said, that's a management abuse. It's kind of like, we want to be sure you're there at 4 p.m. on Friday, so we have to meet. And someone else chimed in and said, and I have a meeting at 8 a.m. every Monday. It's the sort of thing like, we're going to force them to be there and make sure we're taking care of them. To quote my late sister, who was one of the developers at Davis, at one point when the CEO and CFO were trying to figure out sort of some carrot stick techniques for the developers, of course we're all working 60 plus hours a week. She caught me in the hall, and it's sort of like, well, if they ship by this date, we'll do this, and if they don't, we're going to do this. That all got shot down, by the way. But my sister, who was one of the senior software engineers, caught me in the hallway and she said, don't they know they're dealing with grown-ups? And what you'll find is often management doesn't think they're dealing with grown-ups. They see, again, uncertain wizards. They don't understand, most of them, what it is we do. They don't like the fact that it's not predictable because it's not like making bricks. It's like trying to write a novel. I've done it. Published it, I've written novels. It's hard. It's research. It's creative. It's inventive. And the readings you're going to be doing this week, no, it's readings you should have done. You did Webster 3, didn't you? Metrics? Good. Let's talk about it. And this section was just on trying to design effective workplaces. You read it. That's it. Wrong mouse. Okay, there's the mouse. So, let me switch over to Webster 3. I have probably at least half a dozen books on software metrics. And the whole issue of software metrics is pretty much an issue of a lot of bad metrics. The most infamous, of course, is lines of code, which is one of the worst metrics in the world for any number of reasons. But it's easy to automate and collect. And so management likes to do it. It's like, oh yeah, we created this many lines of code. That ignores both the invention process, the research process in software development, also ignores refactoring. Because if you're doing things right, every now and then you'll look at code and say, oh wait, we can combine this in here, or we can have this centralize this over here, and you reduce the number of lines of code. So as a metric of process, it's bad. Now, as per my article, an effective metric, and there aren't a lot, there are some tools nowadays that actually, and we'll talk about this in the last slide, that help with this, but a metric has to actually be informed. It has to tell you something useful, and or it has to predict what progress you're making. It has to be objective, meaning, and this ties into automated. It has to be something that if you get two people and say, measure this thing about this code, they'll come with the same answer, more or less, with the margin of error. And it needs to be automated, because if it's not automated, you'll stop collecting it. This is why lines of code is so popular. It is objective and it is automated. The problem is it's not informative and it's not predictive. In fact, it can be downright misleading. And as I said, almost all major metrics used in projects lack these qualities. Now, that first one can't be emphasized enough. That which gets measured gets fudged. The classic famous story here is a software company, and I'm sure there's been more than one that has done this, that has instituted a bug bounty system. That is, for each bug that is, fixed and closed and passed off, the QA person gets a bounty, say $100. That's a lot, but let's just say it's $100. So you know what happens? QA person talks to a developer, the developer starts introducing bugs, the QA person starts fixing them, and they start, getting those $100 a pop. This is a human truism. This applies across virtually every domain you want to talk about. That which you're being measured for, people will find ways to work that to their benefit. There's a book I cite here. For those who are really interested in software management, particularly those who want to become a project manager, note this book, Measuring and Managing Performance Organizations by Robert Austin. Single best work I have ever read on this issue, because he shows the inherent flaw in management by metrics. He talks about what you can do to try and overcome it, but it is an inherently flawed approach. Metric law of 90s, this has been around for years. This is not original with me. And this ties to the article that I think you'll read in Webster 4 about do not defer the hard tasks. First 90% takes 90% of the schedule, remaining 10% takes the other 90% of the schedule. This ties into Brooks talking about whether or not you schedule 50% time for testing, you'll end up spending that much time anyway. This is what I see over and over again in failed projects. They say they think it's going to take a year, and it takes 2 years, or 2.5, or 3, and sometimes fails altogether. And the metric law of least resistance. This is why metrics need to be automated, because if humans have to do it, they'll get more and more sloppy at it, and eventually they'll just abandon it because it's too much pain to collect. Old joke, old enough that you may not have even heard it. Guy's walking along the city street late at night. He sees this guy on his hands and knees underneath a street lamp. And he walks over and says, can I help you? Is something wrong? The guy looks up and he's obviously had a few too many drinks. He said, I dropped my car keys. Trying to find them. And he says, well, do you know where you're standing when you dropped them? The guy points half a block away and says, I was standing over there. He said, why are you looking for them here? He said, the light's better. That's the problem with a lot of metrics. You go with what's easy, whether or not it's useful. Questions or comments? Anything? Anyone? Anyone had bad experiences with the organizations that are trying to collect metrics or using metrics to guide you or against you? Yes?
Sure one. Not necessarily exactly what the metric was, but since I was just self-driving cars, sometimes make up some random metrics to see your progress or build or demonstrate progress. So he was in charge of kind of fixing a metric they already had, just because two guys had been talking one day and decided that, oh, this might be an interesting metric, and then everyone went along with it, and then leadership got into it, and they were expecting us to be like getting certain goals with this metric, but we didn't even understand the metric, so there was no way to achieve those goals.
Yeah.
So we had to actually spend like a bunch of time fixing it, explaining why we couldn't achieve that metric because it was unreasonable, and then showing new metrics, but it just created way more of a hassle than I ever should have.
And that's a very important one. Those might not have heard it. Basically, someone said, oh, we should collect this metric. And then management said, yes, we should. And no one stopped to ask, is this actually useful? That happens more often than you may think. It's part of this gets back to the, predictive / meaningful aspect of a good metric. At Pages, while we were on our glide path to try and ship the product for the first time, the single most useful metric that we found, this is Jim Hammerly, our VP of Engineering, who came up with it, was the number of defects closed or deferred each week versus the total number open. And as long as that number was less than 1, that ratio was less than 1. No, greater than 1. As long as the ratio was greater than 1, I guess he did the other way. Total number open over the number closed or fixed that week, avoiding division by 0. Basically, if we were always, I lied. Ratio was obviously the number of new defects opened divided by the number of defects closed or deferred. Okay. As long as that was less than 1, it meant we were on a glide path. We were closing more defects or deferring more defects than we were opening each week. And of course, if you get to the point where you're dividing by 0, that's good because it means you didn't open any defects. Okay. Now, the challenge with metrics is that in real life, and we've talked about this before, you can look at these 4 and you can say, yeah, that's sort of, and this is actually our house being built. These are photographs. Actually, the first 2 are a different house, but the same complex, same style. Bottom 2 are actually our house. But visually, with construction, you can look and say, oh yeah, that's just a hole in the ground, that's just framed, this looks like it's getting close to being done, and this one is all painted, and there's a wreath on the door, and it looks like we're doing fine. It's hard to do that with software. This is a visibility problem. And this is why. In a given project, you started the project, you're at some current point, up there. I'm pretty sure I've got a laser pointer at home. I should bring one in. And then you have your project head. Look at this list, and you should have all read this article, so I'm not going to sit and read this to you. But this is the problem, is that the number of things that you have to know in order to predict when you're going to ship is pretty daunting. And sometimes hard to understand, hard to visualize, and hard to assess. If I'm building a house, you know, if we go back, oops. You know, I almost flunked shop in 8th grade, but even I can walk by and, you know, tell the difference between these. And there may be subtle factors that I can't see and understand, but I have a general sense of how they're going. With software, this can be very hard. That's why software estimation remains the single most difficult challenge in software engineering. Not just figuring out how long a new product is going to, or new project is going to take, but figuring out when you're actually going to ship. And as I've already said today, the only control you have is to keep reducing the feature set, simplifying it, until it's within a scope that you can say, okay, I now know exactly how much it's going to take, or at least I've eliminated whole areas of ignorance that I no longer care about because we've dropped those features. How many of you have had experiences with projects where the project seemed like it was moving towards completion and then just kept going on forever and ever? Anyone had that experience? Anyone want to tell some stories? Anyone? Like, yeah.
I was just trying to like think through, like, I feel like for this specific project, we got most of it done, but no one had contemplated like how are we going to roll out into production and like move over onto these new servers. And so that took 90% of the schedule, like so much longer because no one like actually thought about that.
That's very interesting too, because that's something that often gets overlooked. It's like, well, if we have the software done, everything's fine. It's sort of like, you know, if we just build this app and get 1% of the market, we'll all be rich. It's possible to get 0% of the market in commercial application. I know from personal experience. Yes?
Yeah, I remember doing a project. We were rebuilding the intramural systems for BYU. I worked there probably 2 years ago or something. And we got it, and it was really pretty, and it was nice, and we showed it to him, and he was like, I want it to look exactly like the old one. But with these new features, and so the problem with trying to incorporate new features and making it look the same, I don't know, I left. It's still not out, so.
I ran across this twice with failed projects as an expert witness, where they were re-engineering a legacy system, and at some point, the end user said, well, we want it to work just like the old system, but better. And they don't see the inherent contradiction in that. It can't, if you have improvements, it's going to work differently. I mean, that's part of the nature of improvements. But that's one for me to add to my storytelling. Yeah, just make it look like the old one, but with all the new features. And sometimes you have to walk away. Now, this was what I suggested in my third article. The approach, let me back up. One of the projects I worked on at General Dynamics, my first year out of college, one of the engineers there, the engineers, I was a programmer, had an idea. This is Cold War, this is 1978, 79. And the Soviet Union, we had Europe divided into Eastern Europe, Soviet-occupied Europe, and Western Europe, free Europe. Soviets had large collections of tanks stationed all along that border. The idea being, if war broke out, they could immediately move into Western Europe and grab more territory. We, of course, had spy planes, and we're putting up spy satellites at this time, to look down and monitor the movement and position of their forces. The Soviet Union, taking a page from the British before D-Day, built plywood shells that looked like tanks and started putting them on trucks. So they had hundreds of tanks and hundreds of trucks that looked from spy planes or satellites, light tanks, and they were doing a big shell game, moving them around. So this engineer at General Dynamics had a project underway to use side-looking radar. We'd fly helicopters along the Iron Curtain, the border between East and West Germany, and do side-looking radar and bounce them off these vehicles and try to determine if they were trucks or tanks from a radar signal. And the way that he thought this would work is that you'd get a different radar signal coming off of the treads of a tank versus off the wheels of a truck. So he went and gathered, and I worked with him on this as a programmer. He went out to Camp Pendleton, Marine base there in San Diego, and gathered data, radar data, bouncing the same side-looking radar off of tanks and trucks. And we did a Bayesian analysis of the radar signal characteristics, and we found there were 26 characteristics of the radar signal, and we found that with just 3 characteristics we could get a 95% separation and distinguish between tank and truck. This is what led me to this proposal. I thought, you know, we go about this the wrong way. We try to think as per your metric story, where someone said, oh, wouldn't this be a great metric? It's like, no. What you do is you instrument your software development project. You find automated metrics and you collect a whole bunch of them while the project is going on, or while a project is going on. And then you do statistical analysis and find which ones are predictive of progress. A couple of years ago, I found out there are actually some companies out there that do this. They have instrumentation that hooks in to your GitHub or whatever repository that they monitor check-in and check-outs and changes of line and so on, and they collect the data and they find out which are most predictive of the project actually shipping. So and that was something they came up with independently, so I was the only one that thought of this. So this is an approach that has been shown. There are actually commercial systems that you can get out there, one of which is I met with a few years ago at Silicon Slopes here. Just because they had seen my paper and did an article and said, hey, we're doing this. It's like, this is so cool. So long story short is be suspicious of metrics. Unless they are, going back here, informative or predictive, objective, and automated. If they fail at any of those things, then they're probably at best useless and at worst misleading. Any questions or comments? Yes?
How did the tank thing go, like practically?
I don't know. We found all this, and then I was only at General Dynamics for a year and moved on to NASA after that. So I don't know if they ever actually put it into, got a defense contract and tried to put it into production. And in any case, it's pretty much the issue died when Soviet Union collapsed in '88. Anyway.
Yeah, so what can we do if we're at a company that uses like useless metrics?
Lines of code.
Yeah, or something like that.
There's a whole discussion I'll have about how you change things within a company. Well, actually, let me ask you. What was the process by which you basically had to go back to management and say, no, this doesn't really work. This is, we can't do this, and so on. How did that end up playing out?
Well, okay, because we were going on with goals, and over a quarter we wanted to achieve a certain metric, right? And we literally had like data scientists and just various project managers and such coming to us saying, this is why this is bad. We've done all this research into why this is not showing us anything and how we are not going to reach this goal, and it's just going to, be kind of a damper on everything for the quarter. And then we had to actually go through the process of showing even more data, finding other, going through the data, like you were saying. We had to look through a ton of data to see what was actually useful, what was actually showing progress with our changes, because we were finding
Okay, let's go with the, any questions before we launch into the last of the 3 lectures? Do you feel like, let me just ask you, do you feel like you're getting, I don't want to do the reading for you. That's why I sort of skimmed through the slides and so on. I'm assuming you're all seniors in college. You've got the reading. I assume you'll ask questions if you have questions or issues. That's why I stopped most slides and asked you for that. I tell you the stories to let you know how real this is. Plus, it's fun. Let's I have lots of stories, and I try not to repeat them. If you have suggestions or recommendations, feel free to give them now. If you want to give them privately, just DM me on Slack. I want to make sure you're getting what you want to get out of this class. The stuff you're learning here, again, and I don't say this with any, arrogance on my part. Trust me, this is all true. And you've seen that with a lot of the stories that all of you have. But there are reasons why I get regular emails from former students who go out in industry and write me back and say things like, this was the most useful class I had from the CS program. And I don't say that, I'm a big fan of computer science, but the point is, when you get out in industry, these are exactly the sorts of things that you're going to be dealing with and facing. And I just assume you'd be as prepared for that as possible and not have unnecessary culture shock as you go. Okay, Pert and Gantt charts. This next thing you guys are going to do is a project. You're going to create a Pert chart and a Gantt chart, both of them, even though they'll basically be reflecting the same information. Software estimation is hard. Take your estimate to Chuck. Take your estimate, double it, and add 1. Another way is take your estimate and just change the units. 4 days. No, actually, it's going to be 4 weeks. Software estimation is you'd be surprised how often that's accurate. Okay. I think I can do this in 4 days. No, it actually took 4 weeks. You'd be surprised how often that works out. Adele Goldberg says only optimists create complex systems. So as software engineers, we tend to be inherently optimistic. I was very optimistic and frankly very successful through the early part of my career. And I got to Pages and we were a full year late in shipping. And that was the most painful year of my professional life. Because I had done the initial schedule before we hired our VP of engineering. I was the chief software architect, I was chief technical officer, and I had to go before the investors every month and tell them why we were going to be late, why we weren't shipping yet, and why they should believe anything that I say now. In fact, it was literally during that year, I was going back and rereading Mythical Man Month, and Dave Creek, our director of quality, walked by my office, the door was open. And he saw me reading it and said, "Isn't it a little late for that now?" And it was. I had, these are books I had read and I had forgotten everything. That was literally the experience that changed my professional arc. And I went from software engineering and software architecture to this is why projects succeed or fail. And I have been brought in to review and to sometimes rescue projects. I've reviewed lots and lots of projects, failed projects, as an expert witness. I guess at least 50 projects that I've been brought in on. A lot of them settle before I get anything done. At PricewaterhouseCoopers, we gathered information on about 120 lawsuits involving failed or disputed IT projects. Basically about 3 feet of documents on it, and I read it all and wrote a white paper on patterns in IT failure litigation. It's the same thing over and over again. That's why I'm having you read these books. That's why I'm having you read these articles. It's the same root causes over and over again. And the hardest part is estimating how long it's going to take to finish a project. And it goes back to armor. It's why armor is the single most important thing you'll probably read here. There's too much invention, there's too much ignorance. Yes?
Maybe it's just lack of experience, but why do failed IT projects produce lawsuits?
I'm sorry?
Why do failed IT projects produce lawsuits?
Because there's 2 or more parties involved. I'm a company and I hire this outside development firm or vendor to come in and, put in a new system, either a customized version of some off-the-shelf software or a new development system. And it's supposed to take, as a consultant, I went into a company where I had consulted before. I'll leave the name off because this videotape will be out there. And they had hired 2 big name, I can't remember if I already mentioned this, they'd hired 2 big name consulting firms, okay? And it was supposed to take 2 years and 180 million. When I came in, it was 4 years and $500 million. That easily could have gone to litigation. Didn't. But it easily could have. And that's the sort of case where, about half my cases are cases like that, where either the customer loses faith in the developer is ever going to deliver it, and they want their money back, or they want to break the contract. In some cases, it's the developer is trying to do things, the customer is not cooperating, and the customer stops paying the money and say, wait, you owe us money for the stuff we've done so far. So typically in cases like that, you have a suit and a countersuit. Each side is suing the other. But it happens all the time. But it's when you have 2 or 3 parties involved. That's why you have a lawsuit. So, you have the estimation problem, you have trying to actually, you have the ignorance problem, I'll get to you in a second. You have the ignorance problem, trying to think through all the tasks that need to be done. This goes right back to armor. The things you don't know yet that you don't know that you're going to have to solve. Correctly identifying the critical path, and we'll talk about critical path with the Pert Charts. And keeping the schedule up to date. This to me, I think I've mentioned, when I act as an expert witness in these failed projects, one of the things I want is I want a chronological set of all the status reports. And as soon as the status reports, I look for what I call the inflection point. Usually, failed projects start off with both parties in sincere agreement as to what's going to be done, both optimistic it can be done, and there's an inflection point at which point their interests begin to diverge and the project begins to go south. And one of the keys there is when I start seeing status reports that are just the same status report every week with nothing changing. That tells me that either they're just simply copying it or they're trying to hide problems. Now you had a...
Yeah, so you talked about the lawsuit and the counter. You talked about the lawsuit and the counter lawsuit.
Yeah.
Who typically wins those? Would it be like the businesses who they hire, who are doing the software, or the businesses who hired them on?
That's a good question. I would say that it is, and this is, I'm trying to think here. I would have to go back and look, because I've represented both parties. And sometimes, well, actually, there are 2 issues here. First issue is who is actually at fault. Now, it's seldom that one party is entirely at fault. It's not seldom that one party is mostly at fault. Quite often, it's one party really shouldn't have, the developers really shouldn't have taken this case, shouldn't have tried to do it. They misrepresented their expertise and so on and so forth. In some cases, it's the customer. A pattern which I discovered doing my work is what I call the lost champion pattern. Usually when you have a 2-party agreement like this, you have someone on the customer side who's the champion of this project. yes, I think we should bring SAP in here and switch over all our old accounting, HR, so on, manufacturing systems to SAP, which is an enterprise resource planning software package. And someone who's the champion, if that person leaves or is fired, or as has happened literally in one case I was on, dies, the person who takes over her or his spot usually doesn't have the same investment, and may start looking for reasons to get out of this contract, and they start trumping up claims, saying, well, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, you're not doing that, therefore we want to cancel the contract. Either we want to walk away from it, or we want some, on top of that, some money back. So that's an interesting question as to who tends what. Now, here's the other thing you have to realize, okay? These kind of cases frequently go to juries. Juries are juries. When it comes to technical matters, it can be a challenge to get the technical issues across to the jury. It's why I spend all my time looking for appropriate analogies. Even with judges, it can be tricky. I would like to think that in most cases that the party that wins is the party that should win. That's not always the case, and quite often cases like this settle. Sometimes they settle just before trial. I've had a couple that have settled literally in the middle of trial after testimony was given, because one side or the other was worried that they were going to lose and they would end up owing a lot more money than if they just settled with the client. So you've got all these problems with devising a schedule. Nevertheless, you have to devise a schedule. Two common techniques. First is a Pert chart, developed by the Navy in the 1950s, about as old as I am. And this is what a Pert chart looks like. It's a directed graph where you have tasks, and sometimes the tasks will be in the bubbles, sometimes the tasks will be the arrows themselves. You have an estimate of duration, and you're basically indicating dependencies. So for example, in this case, task 3, up there, I know I've got one. Task 3 is dependent on 1 and 2 being finished. Task 4 is not. So task 4 is basically being done in parallel to 1, 2, and 3. So you start with the start node, you end with an end node, and the two things you want are the dependencies and the critical path, which is basically tells you how long the whole project is going to take. Yes?
And never mind, this slide explains. I was wondering about like how important is the duration, but the slide shows it.
Yeah, you put the duration here. So here you've got the days. Here's another chart where the duration is put on the edges. And the critical path is, this is basically, how many of you have done graph theory and have dealt with, yeah, it should have been something exposed to. Basically, this is a weighted, directed graph. Your critical path is your highest value path from start to finish. So here it's highlighted in green, so it goes from 1 to 3, up to 5, down to 6, and over to 8 is the critical path. So what you're going to do is you're going to break down your project into tasks. Keep them fairly broad. Remember, you're on a sprint now. You're what, 7 weeks away from demoing? This is basically to get you to try and think through all the project or tasks you have to do. Let me suggest something which I have learned through sad experience. One of the most effective things to do here is to start at the end. And then say, okay, just before we demo this, what do we have to have done? And identify all those tasks, including the integration of components, and then just keep working backwards. what we tend to do as software engineers, I've seen it so many times, is we tend to be more detailed early on and then get more vague, and we tend to sort of forget, consciously or unconsciously, a lot of the nitty-gritty stuff that's going to be necessary to actually deliver something. So it's always, to quote Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. My experience is in trying to put together the list of tasks, start with saying, here's what we want to demonstrate on November 17th, or whatever the date is. What do we have to have done a week before that? What are the tasks that have to be done? And then keep working backwards. Now, as you go that, guess what you're going to probably do? Drop features. Because you're going to suddenly say, oh my gosh, we have like 7 weeks to do this. We're never going to get this done. I suspect some of you are dealing with that already. So that's the PERT chart, what you're going to do. Any questions on a PERT chart? And trust me, if you want more details, there are tons of websites that will talk to you about PERT charts ad infinitum. Give you details. I suggest you to assign 1 or 2 people on your team to become PERT chart experts. Have them go do the research. Have them find the templates. There are lots of templates out there. Simple tools to do it. So, you're going to identify major tasks, key events, dependencies, first order estimates, and you need to, your PERT chart needs to visually indicate the critical path. Some color, something, thicker lines, something so that when I go and look at your PERT chart, I can say, oh, there's the critical path they have identified. Any question on this? Okay, Gantt charts. That's not an acronym. It's named after Henry Gantt. How many of you have used Microsoft Project? Anyone? Oh, you're lucky then. It's incredibly detailed, and it's one of those things that's so detailed that time and again I've reviewed projects where they create an initial schedule on Microsoft Project and then never updated because it's such a pain. But a Gantt chart, here's a simple Gantt chart, looks like this. The Gantt chart, you actually have an explicit calendar. And then you've got calendar across the top, tasks along this, going down. And you indicate when tasks are supposed to start and stop. You can have dependencies. This is sort of what Microsoft Project tends to look like. I'm not sure, if you really want to do this for your projects, you can, but I suggest you find some templates like this and modify them to your heart's content. Because you want, your 7 weeks, you're going to have broad tasks. Say, this is when we have to start this is when we stop this. This will give you a sense more than the PERT chart. And most with the PERT chart, you simply have durations. So that doesn't really tie you to a calendar. Gantt chart ties you to a calendar. It's like, oh my gosh, this is when we're going to have to deliver our first demo. And once again, work backwards. Major tasks. There may be some correlation between your tasks on your Gantt chart and your PERT chart. There may not. Depends on how you define them. So, now they should have the same end date. There are Word and Excel Gantt templates on the main class wiki page. By that, I mean, if you go back to from the one for our, hang on here, let me close this. Let me close this for a second. All right, where's my mouse? How many of you have Apple Watches? Have you noticed that some notifications get through and some don't. There's a known bug with iOS. And it varies. Wait a second, this is supposed to be, it's not even pushing the login to my request.
Connect
Yeah,
to
that's
console,
what it sounds
and then they tell me which thing.
Oh, there we go. Come on, come on.
I usually have to go into the app if it doesn't.
Come on. Oh, there we go. Okay, why it's not there? Oh, now I get request waiting. What, 3 minutes? Okay. I lied, I thought I had those out there. I will make sure these are out. Well, you can find them online, Gantt templates. I wonder if they're in the class website. Okay, I'll get them out on the class website. Or you can find them, I'll get them out. I'll put them out somewhere, I may just throw out a Slack. Okay. So, you'll need to create, oh. Chuck has this very long podcast on project management. Well, there we go, there are some. I'll post these slides up here too. You can count the entire time watching the project management podcast as billable hours. And still count 2 hours reading. Okay? If you don't want to watch the whole 2 hours, then start at about 63:20 on the first one, and it's about 20 minutes the second one. So your assignment is create both a Pert chart and a Gantt chart. This will be due by midnight. We'll bring them up in class next week, honest, I promise. So we can all see them. And I got your latest stats report due, read PEPLeware Part 3 and Webster 4. So we've got lots of work there to do. Any questions? They're all anxious to get out of here. Okay, I'll post links to some Gantt templates and Slack, and other than that, I'll see y'all in a week.